Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another
Questions of Doom.
That was okay. Questions of Doom.
My balls haven't dropped.
Anyway, this series, as ever, is all about me trying to answer questions that you send my way, or in this case, our way, using the archaeology@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my, or our fond hope, that the answer is not only useful to the person who's asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing, or something similar. Now, today's question of doom comes from Sean, and he says this. Dear Mr. Soup and Rhys, first of all, Rhys, let me say, hopefully you're having a lovely visit to the UK.
I certainly am, Sean. Thank you for asking.
Wonderful. I have never been to Hadrian's Wall, but it looks great, says he. Was it great?
That was all right.
As you're there at Archaeo Soup Towers with Mr. Soup, my question to both of you is this. What is more interesting, a Roman wall or tens of thousands of years of human occupation of a continent? Why do people get so excited about European archaeology and history when places like Australia have a richer heritage than most places on Earth? Interesting language there. I live in Cornwall and have never heard anything about native Australian Aboriginal archaeology in school, despite it being one of the greatest and longest lived human occupation events of all time. Finally, where would you rather dig, Britain or Oz? That's a question for both of you. Thanks for your brilliant videos and keep up the good work, Sean. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you.
Well, so the first part of that, what's more interesting, a Roman wall or tens of thousands of years of human occupation?
Well, it depends on what you're interested in, isn't it? Well, I mean, this is why archaeologists don't specialise in all the same things. For example, at university, I learn about Indigenous Australian history and colonial or historical archaeology, whereas I assume Mr. Soup here would learn a lot about Roman and Saxon archaeology at university.
Well, no. The broadly speaking, it was an overview of Europe and Britain, with a focus on Britain, starting Paleolithic moving forwards, and then you have to sort of do essentially elective modules. So, for example, choosing to focus on the Saxons over the Romans, or choosing to focus on.
But you had those choices, though. That's
the point.
Yeah. See, we didn't have the choice of picking Romans and Saxons.
Oh no, that's true. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I get your point. Yeah. No Romans in Australia.
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Yeah, let's not go. No, let's not go there. No. So, I suppose the question is why then, more broadly speaking, in terms of the public, why is European history seen as more valid? I mean, I'll briefly recount a story. I mean, I think I've already mentioned this in a video before. But there was one time when I was working for the Archaeological Trust, and I was at one of their places, one of their attractions, and someone came over to me and said, this lady from Australia, actually, I think she was from Sydney, came over and said, "Oh, it's so nice to see all this history all around us, isn't it wonderful?" And I said, "Oh, what do you mean? I mean, Australia's been occupied for far longer than Europe has by Homo sapiens, by us, you know." And she goes, "No, I mean white history," and I was stunned by that. I was amazed actually that that's how she was segmenting it all off. Now I don't know if that's just like an Australian cultural perspective or not, but I got a feeling, and have since had the feeling, that people just view what Britain and America have achieved in the last 200, 300, 400, 500 years as to be the pinnacle, and maybe I know Spain and Portugal as well, to be the pinnacle of achievement. You know, that's history, that's archaeology. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, it sounds just about right. I mean, the things that we have to consider, we're not comparing apples and oranges. We shouldn't be comparing indigenous cultures to our own culture. That's a very colonialistic, I suppose even backwards way of thinking these days. The last 50 years of academia has basically been picking apart this idea.
Fetch me a cup of tea, colonialist.
Yes. But yes, they've been picking apart this very colonial point of view that some civilizations are more valid than others. And in first year of undergrad in archaeology, what you learn is that the term civilization, not only being flexible, is also different depending on where you are. So,
and also culture doesn't have to have a capital C. So the idea, so the idea that culture is a Greek sculpture or a painting or a piece of music, a Stradivarius violin, that's not what culture means.
Anyway, the idea of European culture being so much more is, it's not so much more, it is so much more prevalent. It is there, it is in your face, and it is, because Europe is very, very, like the countries in Europe are so much smaller than the continent of Australia.
I like the way you paused there. Europe is no. But no, you're right, yeah, the states that we've carved out in this continent are small, yeah.
And,
smaller.
Yeah, and I mean, one way of thinking it is that there's indigenous Aboriginal countries which are larger than France in Australia, but nobody points that out. No. Even though in modern days, I think it's also partly to do with this idea of Indigenous Australians having their own flag and their own entire, well, not country, but having Australia as a whole and viewing themselves as a whole. A lot of people like myself don't actually agree with that point of view, because there are different Indigenous groups which proclaim their own land rights and country, as it were.
That's where we come back to Celts.
Yeah.
like the idea that all of Europe had this one great big Celtic identity.
And then there was Rome.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, and I suppose that's the thing actually. Maybe that's the key actually, because in the same way that people talk about before the Romans arrived in Europe, everyone was basically the same. Is that maybe people want to do that with Australia before we arrived there? It was just one great big mass of the same culture, and it's not really worth examining too much.
Absolutely, that is something we're also taught, is that Indigenous culture wasn't stagnant for 60,000 years. Exactly. They changed immensely. The creatures changed. For example, gum trees use fire to
propagate.
Yeah. And the idea is that all the plants and animals that didn't use fire died out when the Aboriginals introduced fire stick farming. Now this is only still a theory, I should mention, but it's one that's backed up with a lot of tangible evidence. And
if true, I presume, I mean, because I gather that there would have been an immense global atmospheric effect based on that amount of burning. But also, if true, those cultures have shaped that continent in many ways far more than we have shaped Europe. You know, I mean, because we've cut down trees, we've done some farming here and there, we've made pigs less hairy, you know, but and we've killed giant deer and aurochs and this kind of thing, but really fundamentally changing the type of continent it's both horrific, but also it's an undeniably massive achievement. I mean, it is culture.
Well, that's true, and the thing that we also have to think about is the Indigenous people who did come to Australia at that time. Were they doing it in other places as they were moving closer and closer to Australia? Because the thing is that the Indigenous people didn't come straight from Africa. They went straight across the Middle East today, India, Southeast Asia, to eventually get to Australia. I mean, that kind of travelling within 20 to 30,000 years. A lot of people,
especially when you haven't got an end point in mind.
Well, that's true. It's one would wonder why they travelled so much, but the thing is that they worked it out to be travelling about 10 kilometres a year.
Right.
So it's actually not that far in the span of time, which basically means people can use the resources over the 10 kilometres that they're using, which if living close to the coastline, it isn't that much. So that's one thing. But I honestly believe that the reason why people view this is because of lack of education, more than anything else. And who is to blame for that lack of education? Well, it's partly to do with the archaeologists themselves, but predominantly I would think it's to do with the media.
Yeah.
And the way it's portrayed in this almost colonialistic view again.
Well, also you can also not deny the importance of decision makers in terms of government. So people who are setting educational agendas. For example, recently we had a chap in Britain called Michael Gove. You might have heard of him. Probably didn't, because he's a numpty. But he, I mean, some of his ideas were very interesting. Most of it was a load of nonsense, but it was all basically born out of, when I was a boy, this is how we were taught. And the people making decisions are constantly sort of harking back to their experience in education, which means that actually you're not really. Often it's a very conservative way of viewing the world. So, for example, actually he was being very conservative in terms of writers. I mean, at one point there was even talk about not having American fiction in the British curriculum, only British stuff. And as long as that sort of stuff is going on, you're never going to be able to tackle that sort of small view of the rest of the world. The idea that somehow, Britain in particular is on the top of a pyramid, and and everyone else is kind of.
I just wondered a funny idea, because does this man even consider that an 8-year-old has more information thrust on them these days via the internet and other sources than a 60-year-old, their 60-year-old grandmother or grandfather? That's what's really fascinating to me concerning where we're going these days, is that these young kids, not that they're more intelligent than their grandparents, but they've already stored more information than their grandparents had in a lifetime. A lot of people wouldn't want to hear that, but it's true.
Yeah. Well, I think it probably is true, actually. Nonetheless, we're slightly off topic there, but I think we've tackled to a certain extent the first question, and that is, which is more interesting and why? And I suppose the answer is they both should be equally interesting. But for different reasons, as you say, apples and oranges. Yeah.
Well, it's whatever takes your fancy. To be frank, I'm not particularly interested in Indigenous archaeology. Like the timeline is fascinating, but I'm really fascinated with the Industrial Revolution, for example. So large amounts of production spanning across the world. This seed of globalization which was planted at that time, that is something that deeply fascinates me, but purely from an academic purpose, not this misguided idea of world domination and we are just so much better.
Okay, stroking a cat. McDonald's. No, well, yeah, okay. So you're that's sort of where your heart lies in that sense, and actually that brings us on to the second question, which we'll try and answer fairly promptly, and that is, where would you rather dig? Would you rather dig in Britain or in Australia? Given that you've seen a couple of our sites, quite a range actually of time that you've seen while you've been here, where would you rather be?
Well, it's not so much out of interest, but more out of, I suppose, weather conditions. So in Australia, I wouldn't mind digging in the winter there, winter, spring, which, it'll be a solid between 17 to 30 degrees every other day. But in Britain, I would only dig in summer, apparently, because out of choice, and it's not out of choice, it's out of necessity.
Well, certainly in this part of the country, yeah. I mean, we were vaguely sort of fantasising about doing a 1x1 test pit in the garden and filming it, but the weather's just not permitted it. It's either been really, really cold wind, snow lying on top, or just the ground's frozen solid, or the ground is just like a mulchy milkshake, and you wouldn't be able to you'd just be like digging in chocolate mousse. So it's okay. Yeah. So yes, summer in Britain and sort of spring in Oz. Okay. Well, for my part, I have to say, out of familiarity in terms of how to go about working, it has to probably be Britain, because I know how things work here. But and I know that there's lots of, I think, probably very good structures in place in Australia, which I'd have to try and get my head around. So I couldn't just dive in basically in Oz. That said, though, if I had the chance, I'd love to do a bit of digging on I suppose as you found the Victorian freestanding buildings here fascinating. I'd like to see what they look like as archaeology. So yeah, here they've survived, there they didn't. So going to a place like Sydney, Melbourne, and seeing what's left, and it's a little bit. I mean, we do have some of those sites in like places like York and Manchester, especially. You have some of this stuff, but actually seeing that, I suppose those that colonial way of living, because it would be a different shade. You know, it'd be some of the same ideas, some of the same building techniques, but with a different slant on it, different products, for example.
Well,
bottles. You know.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting things is when you look at early Australia colonial archaeology, what you're actually finding a lot of the time is everything's being imported from Britain specifically. When you get further on, what you're starting to find by the early 1900s is that people are coming in from all over the place now, and the artifacts and the archaeology is starting to take a more multicultural turn by this stage. So you're actually finding China ware from China, for example, after the gold rush, so 1854 onwards. Victoria's population was in fact close to 25% Chinese.
Right, okay.
But Australia's first law was basically White Australia policy, so they all got sent back home by 1902.
Wow, you've got governance. What do? Kick them out.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh dear. Anyway, yeah, that's becoming a bit of a hot topic here in Europe as well, actually, at the moment. But we're not going to get into politics. Okay, interesting. But yeah, again, I'd really like to see that. I'd really love to see that. So hopefully that we've gone some way to answering both portions of your question there, Sean. Thank you so much for asking the question. And I suppose actually, yeah, it's been a nice opportunity to compare and contrast a little bit, because we are, while we're both archaeologists with similar training, we come from very different academic and professional, in the sense of digging professionally, backgrounds. So very interesting. Okay, well, again, thank you so much, Sean. If you have any thoughts or comments, folks, please do comment below. We look forward to reading them as ever, and as ever, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.
See you later.